The struggle for gender equality continues to play out around the world. Here in the United States, you can find strong advocates of gender justice for places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, and a myriad of other developing countries across the globe. But what about the struggle of women in developed nations? Do women in America still have something to fight for? Recent articles point to an ongoing debate. Equality is still an illusion, some say, while others claim women in developed nations have never had it so good. Tonight, we ask our esteemed guests and audience members to discuss this issue in depth. In 2010, is the issue of women's rights still important in the United States of America?
Good evening, everyone. I am Christian Dorsey, and this is VoiceBox. March is Women's History Month, and it's a relatively recent addition to the calendar of month-long observances for groups that have been marginalized in the larger narrative about American history. But our question tonight on VoiceBox is, in 2010, are women's rights and women's issues still a matter of national concern? We have a great panel of guests tonight, and we also have some members of our studio audience who will also be invited to participate in this very fascinating conversation. We have a very accomplished group of women who can really help us think about modern times and whether or not the centuries-long struggle for equal rights for women is still relevant in our national conversation. We have Dr. Patricia McGuire, who is the president of Trinity Washington University. Trinity has been around for over 100 years, right?
That's right, yes.
And she is leading Trinity in its newfound growth movement, right, which I'm sure she'll tell us a lot about tonight.
Absolutely.
We have the president and CEO of the National Women's History Museum. Please welcome Joan Bradley Wages. It's a museum effort that she'll tell us a lot about, but it's a vibrant museum effort that is in search of a home. We also have Joan Bryna Michelson, who is a communications and leadership consultant who has had an extensive career in marketing and public relations, and who is the president and CEO of the eponymous J.B. Michelson and Associates. And then we also have Catherine Azelford from Georgetown University, the Georgetown Theater Company, who is here to tell us about a very interesting new thing that I didn't know anything about, the Support Women Artists Now Day, which is an upcoming program later on this month.
Yes.
So we've got a lot to talk about here on VoiceBox tonight, and let's just get to it. I want to know how all of you, very accomplished professionals, but working in very different areas, higher education, broader education, working in the area of mostly corporate efforts and the arts. How did you come to get involved in all of these various efforts where actually focusing on women's issues is central to the mission and the objectives of your organizations? Why don't we start with you, Pat?
Well, Trinity was founded 112 years ago because women could not then attend Catholic University across the street from us. So we've been a women's college all of this time, and we continue that tradition today. Excuse me, I have a little cough.
That's okay.
So Trinity has, for 110 years, really focused on the education and advancement of women, the development of women leaders in our society. And we're very proud of that.
Wonderful. Joan.
The National Women's History Museum was founded to honor women's many contributions to our nation. And amazingly enough, there is no place in the center of our nation's capital to honor women and their roles and the roles that they've played in building our nation. And so we think that it is critically important to have a place where women's lives are honored. And because it's here in Washington, that impact will ripple around the world.
All right, well, sitting next to Joan, we also have another Joan. Joan Michelson, tell us a little bit about your work, which has been a fascinating array of various activities, mostly in the corporate sector, but certainly by looking at your website, gender issues and are a central focus for everything that you do.
Well, I discovered in marketing businesses that the women's market was untapped, very powerful, and ignored. And that there weren't enough women in leadership. And frankly, the women that were in leadership that were really cool. And as a reporter, I started doing stories as well on notorious women. I come a little bit at this from DNA. I discovered actually recently, which actually made me feel a lot better. My great-great-aunt was a leader in the suffragette movement and a prominent reporter who covered Susan B. Anthony and is quoted in many books on her. which made me feel that I had sort of come by it, you know, in my DNA, as it were. But I really discovered that women were driving markets and nobody was paying much attention. And when I did appeal to the women's market and to women leaders, things worked. Sales went up, messages got across, candidates got elected, etc. So you follow the research and you follow the success.
Okay. And Catherine, tell us a little bit about your work and the upcoming Swan Day.
Well, Swan Day stands for Support Women Artists Now Day, and Swan Day on the whole was not my idea. It came from Women Arts in San Francisco. Martha, I hope I get Richardson, I believe, was one of the two geniuses who came up with Swan Day. And 3 years ago, I noticed while I was looking for grants, of course, on the web, that Women Arts was asking people to go forth and create Swan Day events, and so we had our first DC Swan Day in 2007, and we're about to have our third, which is one of the biggest Swan Days in the country, and it's an international holiday. I think most of it is concentrated in the U.S. We're going to be in 5 different venues in Georgetown on the 27th of this month, Saturday the 27th, presenting films by women directors. I'm working with Melissa Houghton of Women in Film and Video on that. A staged reading marathon. We had an open call on the web and we got 46 plays. We can only do 13 of them. They're staged readings. We have a one-woman play, performance art, storytellers, a monologuist, poets, a woman composer who's a keyboardist playing her own work. Probably a bunch of things I'm leaving out right now, and it's all free. Grant writing. It's all free, all over Georgetown from noon to mostly it winds down around 6, but there's a big event in the evening from 7 to about 8:30, a new play, a collaborative work written by 5 women who actually are not even in the same room together. They're emailing each other and creating this work. And it's going to be fun. I hope everybody comes down.
Through email, interesting.
Yeah.
All through email,
Wonderful.
writing a play.
Well, you know, thinking of the arts, I'm struck by just a couple of weeks ago at the Academy Awards. It was a very touching moment that was, you know, still memorable for me because I had no idea that there was any more history left to be made with the Academy Awards. But, you know, I remember, you know, Barbra Streisand introducing the Best Director and noting that, you know, this could be a landmark achievement. And when Catherine Bigelow's name was announced, you know, she beamed, the time has come. And I'm sure for many folks, it was news to them as well, that there were still barriers yet to be broken by women in major areas. So just sort of tell me a little bit about where you think our country is in 2010 with women breaking through the proverbial glass ceilings in a variety of different occupations and sectors. Anybody?
Well, I mean, that was such a great moment at the Academy Awards, and I hadn't thought about the fact that there was no woman Best Director before. In you know, so I've paid attention to that. But in our work at Trinity, because we inspire women of all ages to go on into executive and leadership positions, we study women's leadership all of the time. One of our famous alums is Nancy Pelosi, the first woman ever to be Speaker of the House. Kathleen Sebelius, who is now Secretary of Health and Human Services, one of only 12 women governors previously. But the fact of the matter is that women hold fewer than 25% of most leadership positions in editing and publishing, in medicine, in law, even university presidents. Women are only 23% of university presidents today, even though women students are 57% of our population. So women still have a long way to go.
And it gets much worse in corporate America. Only 3% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Only 15% of board of directors members are women. And there's even 13% of the Fortune 500 women boards that don't have any women. The White House Project came out with the benchmarking women's leadership report that has some really depressing statistics on this, and she's quoted some of them, but there's a real disconnect. What's happened is that women have made a huge mark in the entry level and mid-level ranges, and then plateaued. And then there's this big gap. And so we haven't really reached leadership in what is called a critical mass. And things are not going to change until we reach a critical mass, which most experts believe is a third of the population, whether it's in Congress. I mean, Congress is only, you know,
17%.
Yeah, exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so these statistics are all at the tip of all of your tongue. So this
Well,
concept of the glass ceiling
Well,
is
we've
still
also
very much
had to
alive
live
in
with
us.
it, Christian.
Right, exactly. And I'll point out to you that the Equal Rights Amendment was actually written in 1921 by Alice Paul, and it still has yet to be completely implemented. So we're still working our way through this. And back to the issue of women in the film industry, we're just about to launch an online exhibit. We have 19 online exhibits about various aspects of women's history, and we're about to launch one on women in film. And there were actually women heads of studios in the 20s.
Is that right?
Really?
But in the late 20s and in the 30s, these women, there was an effort to, and there were women directors and there were screenwriters and all of this, and they were just ousted out of the industry in the late 20s, early 30s, and it's taken this period of time for women to gain those positions again.
Interesting.
You know, in the arts, women can be very visible, and I didn't know until I was actually doing some reading. There was something last year, and now this year, you may have heard of Marcia Norman, the playwright, Night Mother, getting out, published a paper, and I read it, but I don't have the statistics at my tongue. I was surprised by how few women playwrights and directors are in the upper echelons of theater. Here in DC, I think we see a pretty good percentage of women, but largely these are the small groups, the startup groups. It's similar to what you said, Joan, about reaching critical mass. She had some very appalling statistics of, I'm trying to remember how few it was, but even when women's plays are produced, she says that her students, and she's a playwriting teacher at Juilliard, they may get one production, where a man, if he has a successful play, will get maybe 10 productions. Other things to look at are that women's plays are more popular when they are writing what she calls men's plays, women with guns. It reminds me of, in 1989, I took over the Georgetown Theater Company from the original artistic director. We'd started it as a group right out of Catholic U. But he left to go to New York and seek his fortune. And I had been doing a lot of the play choices even before then. And one person asked me, well, now that you're in charge, who's picking these, and this is a quote, testosterone-powered plays? Well, we did a lot of classic theater, and if you know classic theater, particularly Renaissance through 18th century, you have the comedies, you know, people with fans, but you also have the tragedies with the swords.
Right.
But women aren't viewed as picking testosterone-powered plays, and a lot of women in classic theater, often it's deconstructed, it's sometimes intellectually satisfying. I won't say always, but you will see fewer women directors picking the hard-hitting approaches to classical plays, the hard-hitting street rumble, street rumble Romeo and Juliet, or the hard-hitting I Want Power Macbeth. Yes, they will direct it, but more likely, more often than men, though certainly not always, it becomes kind of intellectualized, kind of enervated, not quite as bloody and juicy. And I don't know why. The Greeks, they had powerful women in their plays. I mean, women were really oppressed in Greek society, but you read plays like Medea or the Trojan Women or Hippolytus, the Phaedra character, and you know, those
Certainly
women
strong
are,
women.
they scare the heck out of me.
Well, there are two really interesting stories that correlate to that. One is, speaking of Juilliard, they did a really interesting experiment where they had candidates be behind a screen and audition. And they found that when they were behind a screen, there was equal representation among men and women according to talent.
Musicians,
when
right?
they were musicians, right. When they were not, when they could see the gender, the men were chosen more often. But my favorite story, speaking of testosterone-filled art, is Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling tried for many years to get her books published, and every single publisher that she went to, which were all the big houses, said, oh, little boys will never buy books by a girl. And she finally found some little agent who said they'll take it on, and they went to Scholastic, which was like, you know, not exactly Simon & Schuster or HarperCollins, which, by the way, are run by women now. And they said, okay, we'll do it. And now, you know, she's laughing all the way to the bank and guess who's buying most of the Harry Potter books?
And I don't know if it was apocryphal or not, but I heard a little bit about that, and her name is Joanne Rowling, but they went with J.K. in order to make her gender not apparent.
Yeah, they said, we'll do it under J.K. so they can't tell that you're a woman. By the way, my aunt, who was a leader in the suffrage movement, was also a writer of sci-fi novels, but she wrote under her full name.
Well, you know, this
a little
really
different 100 years ago.
just invites the question. I mean, you balance all of these very real and incredibly distressing stats and data that you all are citing, but you balance that against what are some very real data points on the opposite end. You know, for example, during this recession, there is huge increase in male unemployment, and female unemployment is actually you know, statistically much lower. We look at purchasing power and economic decisions that are made in the home, and we see women at all-time high levels in terms of money that they're bringing into the household, and certainly the decisions that they make in terms of household spending and household finances. Help me make sense of all of this. How do we look at 2010? What's the actual state of women in our society? Are we pleased with the progress, or are we distressed with how far yet we have to go?
First of all, you have to drill down into all of that data and look at the kinds of jobs that women hold and the kinds of jobs that men hold. Men tend to be in those manufacturing positions like auto and so forth, and those are suffering in this recession terribly. Women tend to be in service positions and low-wage positions, and so women don't consume as much of the corporate dollar, if you will. You know, 77 cents on the dollar, actually. The other piece of this that we've got to talk about is when people say, well, women have it fine and the revolution's over. They absolutely are only talking about the smallest possible slice of predominantly white, middle class, upper middle class women with the opportunity for a collegiate education. For Black and Hispanic women in this country, the revolution hasn't even begun in many ways, and when we take social class into account, the revolution for women of low income of all races and backgrounds just hasn't even begun. And we have to look at the data in the light of who is really earning money, who is taking care of families. You know, matriarchies are all over the place. So yes, women are bringing money into households because there is no man to bring money into the household. And so you just can't take the top level data and say that tells the story.
Okay.
Well, in CAPS, the Center for American Progress just did a really interesting piece on the status of the unmarried woman. And 63% of the unemployed are unmarried women, and they get paid less, they work part-time, to your point, and they have more stable jobs that can't really be outsourced because they are service industry, but they are getting less health care, fewer retirement benefits, and they are overall higher levels of poverty as well. And she's absolutely correct. It's a huge piece of the problem that's just sort of shoved under the rug.
Let's examine this equal pay issue, which is something that is frequently cause for concern in the news. And there are folks, and believe me, I'm not suggesting that this is my argument, but in the interest of having a full discussion, we need to put it out there. You know, folks say that, you know, looking at the 76, 77 cents on the dollar is a top-line statistic that doesn't take into account the distributional aspects of the jobs that women choose to take, or maybe in some cases are forced to take, with the desire to have greater flexibility in the case of family planning, or having an opportunity to maybe have more flexible work situations. So looking at that 77 cents on the dollar is not necessarily the full story, because we still have a society where men are largely expected to, when they work, to work long hours, hard, bring home the bacon, and that may, in effect, cause a lot of the disparity in wages and income.
Every woman I know on my campus at Trinity is expected to work hard, long hours, and bring home the bacon, care for her kids, and feed those kids. And you know, I have many single parents among my student population, whether they're age 17 and 18 or age 48 and 50. I think that whole argument that women should be satisfied with 77 cents on the dollar keys off of several things that are, in fact, very much part of the previous male hierarchy about about work and so forth, and it presumes that women should aspire to work exactly the way men used to work, rather than having men aspire to work the way women want families to work. And to some extent, this argument needs to burst apart the traditional notions of jobs and moving up that corporate ladder, and instead look at why do men feel that there is this stereotype that they have to be the breadwinner and bring it home? Why can't it be shared in partnership? And we see that in many cases where there is an intact family, where there is a lot of sharing. I know many couples who now prefer to share child care duties and that sort of thing. That is an old, outmoded stereotype about how work works and how wages work.
And that's part of the problem, too, is that the workplace has to adapt to a new paradigm. We need to get child care. We need to have truly family-friendly programs. I mean, the Shriver report that Maria Shriver did with the Center for American Progress calls it, we no longer have the battle of the sexes, we have negotiation. Because people have the same needs across their own family. A man is never asked who's going to watch the children. Right. It's ridiculous. And yet our systems, our corporate structures, every hierarchy in every industry is still structured around that kind of male-dominated picture of tradition.
And you had mentioned the types of jobs that women take, even among what I think you might refer to as upper socioeconomic levels. At least when you're, they said not to touch the microphone. At least when you're my age, and I'm in my late 40s, there was more of it was more appropriate for women to major in something like art history, which doesn't necessarily pay well, even if it can be an upper class job, than it would be for a woman to major in science or business, beginning to be accepted more in law. Now you might say, well, why do you talk about when you were young if you're in your late 40s? But aren't these often the women who are peaking at the tops of their careers who are being measured when they measure the 77 cents on the dollar? Is yes, you've got the educated women and they're working at the National Gallery of Art and they're only a GS-11 and they have their master's degree, or if not their PhD, and they're a curator, and even those who are achieving something and who've had the privileges, if they're in their 40s or 50s, might have made choices that gave them a lower income than a man who majored in business or something technological.
But if they have the same job and the man would have being paid the dollar, why don't they get the dollar? It doesn't matter how they got there. The fact
that
is
they often make choices, even women who have opportunities, if they're older, and those might be the people that are being measured, made choices that were not as lucrative.
Well, this is the problem that has to be fixed, because we don't have, every career trajectory is not created equal.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Indeed. Yeah. I want to get to this issue a little bit more in depth, because in sort of figuring out the narrative for where women are in the United States now, and Joan Wages, this really is for you. You have an effort to try to get a permanent home for the National Women's History Museum, and I understand that's been a long process and one that has no immediate resolution in sight.
Right.
Forecasting, projecting to the day where you get it done, what is going to be the larger narrative that you tell about women's history?
Well, we want to tell the stories about the women's fight for the vote. I mean, 72 years it took, for women to get the vote, and various and sundry steps that women have taken to gain rights over these years. But just as importantly, there's a quote, Drew Faust, who's the president of Harvard, says, "History lights the path to the future." So it's just as important that we use that history as a springboard into talking about these issues that we're talking about here. That how did we get to this point? And in understanding that, it will foster a greater dialogue, but that's when we need to bring in men as well as women to that table to talk about that dialogue.
Well, you all are invited to join this dialogue by calling into VoiceBox. The number is on your screen. Certainly our studio audience is also invited to join in on the conversation as well. Let's look at men and their role in all of this. And we've talked a little bit about men needing to, sort of get past the stereotypes of the way their roles are in a family. What other things do men need to do to advance some of the issues and concerns that you're bringing out tonight? How can men be allies in these efforts?
I would just like to point out that it was men who voted to give women the vote.
Indeed, right, yeah.
This is true.
So the majority of men will come to the right decision at the right time.
Right,
Well,
right.
and we need them to be. I mean, there's a
Absolutely.
friend. There's a friend of mine who shall remain nameless at the moment, who is a leader in the business world and in the political world, who is a 60-something white male, very successful, who says the dirty little secret is you find men like him who are going to support women, but they want to do it for their daughters. They don't necessarily want their wives to work and to do those things, but if they find men who have daughters because they want to do it for their daughter, who's the next Catherine Bigelow or the next Susan B. Anthony or what have you.
You know, it's really generational too, and we have to realize that this business of moving the glass ceiling back, and you know, it's got to be generational. I sit on a lot of boards. I am the only woman in a lot of rooms, and I've had a chance to study this over time to see how it feels. And there are some boards where I just actually sit very quietly, because I know my place in that room, and that's not like me. But I'm reading the tea leaves, because I don't want to be kicked out either for, you know, sort of living up to a stereotype of the mouthy woman, you know. I've had men tell me, oh, you seem to have a lot to say, you know, and it's true, but you know, it's said.
How dare you?
Now, I was at one board meeting once, and we were sitting at dinner, and the guys at the table were saying that they really wish that our next board meeting could be held at the Augusta National Golf Club, because these guys are golfers. And they went on about what a great place Augusta was and all, and I was eating my salad, and I just looked at them and said, but what about me? I said it very gently and politely. Well, I mean, daggers, you know. I really stopped that conversation, and they said, oh, we forgot about that. Now, those gentlemen were of a certain age, but
this is what corporate America did. This is, I mean, I can't tell you stories, frankly, but I mean, I could, but I won't. Let's put it that way. Of situations where they would, the boys in the room would manipulate business meetings and networking meetings, so that the two places that where women were not allowed. I mean, Carly Fiorina tells a classic story in her book of them meeting at a strip club, and she went along with her little suitcase. And the stripper, some of the guys were trying to, and the stripper said, not while she's here. And the guys got it. And her message was, you're going to treat me like one of the guys, or you're going to get over it. You know, but this is what has to happen. And the irony is, we are at a crisis moment economically where all of this presents a huge opportunity to take Humpty Dumpty apart and put him back together again differently. The leadership qualities that we need right now are strongly more associated with and used by women, the more collaborative, more transformative ways. Companies are perceived as having more credibility, more accountability, more transparency, and frankly, 35% more revenues, if you really want to know. I have more numbers from the White House project than when they have more women in corporate offices. And this is an opportunity for us to take the system apart and say, look, we need to grow the economy, okay? We need a green economy. We need, you know, women are very concerned about green. Women, as you say, are the main purchasers. We need the science and technology training. This is an opportunity for us to take all of this and say, well, you know, this is a generational shift. We have generations coming up now. We can do this differently.
Thank you. Do we have a question in our audience? Yes.
I was just going to ask about, getting back to the film industry. In the late 20s and 30s, I believe you said that there was an ousting of women in that industry. Do you know the causes of that, or what was the trend that made that happen?
I'm not aware of what the trend, but what we do know is that after women got the vote in 1920, that there was more or less a backlash. So I suspect that these two things were related. And at the same time, the film industry in this particular case was looking for a way to make film an acceptable place for women to go. So it was, they were focusing more on women who were in the home and trying to make it acceptable. So I suspect at the higher levels it was a backlash from
I can actually shed a little light on that.
Oh.
That was about the time that the studio system really began to rock. You had really just about, I wish I had my notes, maybe three major studios. You had Paramount, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and Warner Brothers. And you had some smaller studios. And prior to that, in the 20s, earlier 20s particularly, you had a bunch of very small studios, some of which were artist-run and were more open to women. Because, and here I am saying we need more women in film, but there were women actors, not so many women directors. There were a couple, and Anita Loos was a writer. They were able to initiate their projects and call it a studio, but it became big business. And in a way that was very good for films. But when it became big business, the businessmen took over, and we had a different mindset. You may recall that United Artists began with D.W. Griffith, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and her then husband, Douglas Fairbanks. An over 40 moment there. They founded it, and one of the other smaller studio executives said, well, the lunatics have taken over the asylum because the artists were running it. But you had women directors then. Lillian Gish mentioned that when one of the studios was being rebuilt, and D.W. Griffith asked her to direct her sister, Dorothy, and I think the film was remodeling her husband, and she thought she did a great job, you know, remembering quoting this, well, not quoting, but recalling from her autobiography. And when it was over, she asked Griffith how he did, because they'd had to rebuild the studio, and he said, oh, I'm no fool. I knew the boys would work harder and faster for a girl. So that was why she got to direct it, so that they would get the studio built for her.
That's really fascinating. Yeah.
Well, great stuff. Thanks for that question, John. We have another question from our audience, and would you please stand? Thank you.
It seems, and I used to teach gender and politics. I'm a stay-at-home father who teaches preschool now. My wife is in sciences and math.
Like you.
So I'm coming from a totally different perspective. Also, my wife's grandmother was a physics major in the turn of the century, and her mother is the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. So I come from her. She comes from a family of very strong women. I see what you're talking about as very one-sided in some ways, because there's also an overhaul of how women have to perceive society. As a male preschool teacher, people come in and say, oh, I want my child to have a male teacher. I think it's great that you're teaching preschool. When I walk in a park with my son, they pull their kid away. And this is regular. When I had an infant and I had a dog, I would walk in the park every day, and every day around 3 o'clock, we go for long walks. And once a week, there was a woman who said, it was nice of you to give your wife a break in the middle of the day.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is not, I mean, this is not something that's, my friends have seen this happen. I've been in a pool where kids have come up to me who know me, give me hugs, the mothers will pull them away.
Yeah.
So there's a different perspective, not only of the men, but of the women coming into society, that men are also taking on different roles, and you have to look at that, and there has to be a different change there also.
Well, that goes
Thanks
to
for
the
that.
media. We really need to address. Thank you so much for that, because some of the studies have shown that women say they're frustrated, but they also refuse to give up the home part. They kind of do this, you know. They say, well, we don't, you know, woe is me, but I'm still going to take care of the kid, and I'm still going to be over, you know, that kind of thing. So I actually I really support that. Thank you so much. But the other side is the news media tends to cover the drama, which, by the way, don't punch me in the nose, but it's consumers again, because they follow the ratings. If we didn't watch this stuff, they wouldn't put on air, okay? They put on, it's a business, they put on what's going to get them the ratings. They put on, you know, the types of anchors and et cetera, and the types of topics that follow the ratings. I mean, I've been on the other side of the fence. Now, what we do need is we need more women, you know, as editors and managing directors and news directors and producers, et cetera. And there's more. For example, the Financial Times now has had 2 U.S. managing editors in a row, which is very cool. Very interesting. But we need to change those figures. Women need to change also. He's absolutely correct. We need to let go. And the news media is painting men with children in a more predatory way, which is its own discrimination.
I used to run a summer camp, and it was fun. But people would apply, and we'd write them letters with packets, and I would always put my phone number on it. And we would have a few calls that were a little off, and it was usually the mothers of very young children who hadn't had a school experience before. And sometimes they were just off in ways that were benign, like, can I come tour the facility? Well, we're in a school, and you can't come tour the school right now. But one person asked me, you don't have any male teachers, do you? And I said, of course we do. I'm very happy that we do, because she didn't want her child near a male teacher. And there are a few people out there that think that way. I hope they're in the minority. I don't know why they think that way. I wonder if it might be that, don't punch me in the nose, but there might be a small group of women who are stay-at-home moms who are just very traditional and think there's something strange about that.
Or it's not.
I hope they change.
It's the socialization of our society.
Right.
I mean, it is a known fact that many women will not go to surgery with a woman surgeon. I mean, there are biases and stereotypes about who should be in certain professions. And in fact, the women's rights movement, just like the civil rights movement, striving for a colorblind society, we should be a genderblind society. And the ultimate victory for everybody is that nobody gets stereotyped in whatever job they want to hold, that you should be able to be accepted and to have whatever kind of work you have the talent and capacity and inclination to do. So I've always said that if it works for women, it should work for men too, that by breaking through the stereotypes we see, it should help men become more teachers, become more nurses, move into the so-called female professions.
The best teacher my son ever had was a retired Marine Corps colonel who decided to go back to being a teacher.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And I was a stay-at-home mom, did it again, for a few years. So I'm not stereotyping stay-at-home moms, but there was also another mother just a few blocks away who told me how, her husband was a lobbyist and she was the only person in her set who didn't have a maid. There are a few of them out there who still want to find the wealthy husband.
But again, this is
not helping
this
anybody.
Is who we're perceiving as credible in a given job. I mean, I think that the woman surgeon thing, it's not. I don't see it as, well, they should be in this job or not should be. It's what makes them feel safe that person is credible in their job, and so that's what we need to change in terms of the teachers and the doctors.
But most discrimination and the impact of most discrimination is never able to be acted upon, because discrimination occurs with what I see, and people have already made their decision and walked away. And that's where while we've had 50 years of great civil rights legislation in this country, but we still have rampant prejudice that is uncontrollable, because people make decisions based on what people look like, and those decisions are not controllable.
And it's emotional.
And let's think about this. It was very apparent, in 2008. We had a presidential election, historic. You had an African American and you had a female contesting the Democratic nomination, and just, I guess, not surprising, but shocking nonetheless, was that there were so many people, women included, who dismissed Hillary Clinton, even though they may have been Democrats, because, largely because she was a woman. And I'd just like to get at that issue a little bit more, about women themselves being a part of the problem, if you will, of moving larger society past where you all want it to be.
Well, but this wasn't, Hillary is, you can't look at any one person as representative of the entire gender. We all have our own story. And first of all, I lead change for a living. Okay, the first person who leads change and breaks eggs and cracks heads together is going to get all the grief. Okay, she's been the first one to do a whole lot of things. And so there are people, and because of her whole story, there are people who just don't like her. And she's very strong, and there are, generations of people on every color and gender, etc., who believe that, they just don't like strong women for one reason or another, and they can't see a woman as commander-in-chief. But on the other side, you also have the statistics showing that Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin both made it more acceptable for people now to see women as President and Vice President of the United States.
But you know, I'm going to answer that in a slightly different way.
Sure.
Being a leader of an institution that includes a women's college, you know, people frequently ask us in the women's college world, well, isn't that, you know, outmoded? You know, shouldn't women go to school with men because you have to learn how to compete with men? And we have a very different take on this. Women need to learn to work with other women and build coalition with other women. And we also find that a woman's greatest barrier to success is herself. It's inside her own head. And it's breaking out of the gender stereotypes that have been created in her socialization, and learning not to be afraid of other women, not to see women as competitors for the men, if you will, or for attention. And women's colleges are fewer in number today. There's just 50 institutions today. There were 300 at one time. But far from being outmoded, we are serving a population of women who get it about how to be empowered by overcoming your own sense of gender stereotype. It's kind of countercultural, but it really works. And we're seeing this surge of students into the women's college in recent years because as a result of the Hillary factor, as a result of the Pelosi factor and other, new generations of women are saying, how do I become powerful? How can I do that? And frequently, in a coeducational environment, they don't have a chance to explore those questions all the time. Sometimes they're told, and it's not true in every school, but in some schools, the peer culture will say, well, you shouldn't want to be powerful. You know, what's wrong with you? And women have to find ways to break out of the put down. You know, if you want to be in charge, there must be something wrong with you, you know? And in the women's institutions, we say, no, that's what you should want.
Indeed. I think we have another question from our audience. And could you please stand when you address your question? Thank you.
You want to go ahead? Go ahead. Okay. I just wanted to ask Joan Wan there about what is the status of the Equal Rights Amendment, and would it make a difference if it passed? I mean, I remember in the beginning it was like every week you'd hear something when states were working on it and all that, and then it just went away. And I worked in the Hart Building for many years, and the Sewell Belmont House is right there. And I always think of that as a center of women's history, but I may be wrong, and I don't know.
I mean, it certainly, it was the center, it was the home for the National Women's Party when women were lobbying to get the vote in 1920. So absolutely, it was Sewell Belmont House is a fabulous place. Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney from New York introduces the Equal Rights Amendment in every Congress since she's been in the House, and that's been about 8 terms now, I think. And I mean, it's not something that we follow at the museum. We don't advocate for anything except for our building site that we're trying to get. That's right there at the mall, which Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney introduced again. She's a strong supporter on women's issues, but I mean, there are a lot of pros and cons about the whole Equal Rights Amendment, and pieces of it. I mean, you know, the Lilly Ledbetter was a piece of the Equal Rights Amendment that just passed. So, you know, some pieces of it have certainly passed, but it's just very interesting that it was written so early, you know, and that in its entirety it has not passed.
You know, the other thing I just want to insert here too, we have a web of laws that does very much the same thing as the Equal Rights Amendment in many ways, but they're under attack all the time, and most notably Title IX, the law that equalized women's opportunity in education throughout. Every year there is an assault on Title IX, usually by men's wrestling coaches. You know, and the Title IX problem is that men's football is so expensive at universities that it's very hard to equalize funding with football, and so all the other men's sports have to disappear, and it becomes this kind of fake argument. I think we need to be very vigilant that Title IX remains strong and vibrant, because the ability of women to be treated equally on university campuses has changed the ability of women to be leaders in corporate life and public life and so forth. And if we step back from that, we're going to see, you know, a diminution of women's influence.
Well, and they learn teamwork in sports. I mean, they learn all of the things that they learn in sports, and all the dynamics that they learn that boys for years learned in sports.
That's right.
Girls now learn in title as a result of Title IX. I mean, there's a whole list of famous women athletes now that would never have had a chance
That's
without
right.
Title IX.
Yep.
Well, you know, this is interesting because, you know, Title IX, notwithstanding, a lot of what we've talked about tonight are not legislative battles that you'd like to see fought, but really attitudinal battles, which in many ways are much more difficult. And, you know, I'm struck by just a lot of things. But recently, I'm a big sports fan, and watching the Olympics, the recent Winter Olympics, and there's a threat potentially that in future Olympics they're not going to have women's hockey contested because there are two dominant teams, the United States and Canada, and the rest of the world is so far behind. And the Olympic movement doesn't like that non-competitive aspect of it.
They killed softball.
And they
for
killed
that very
softball for
reason.
the very same reasons. And you know, sports has kind of,
Yeah.
in many ways, been a bellwether for sort of attitudes about a lot in society. And I'm just curious. You know, we expect and honor dominance by men's athletic teams. You know, people love when the New England Patriots almost went 19-0. Why do you think there's that feeling that women's sports can't have that level of dominance? You can't have superior performances by women's teams and women's individuals?
It all gets back to, I don't mean to beat up on media, but it's about television revenues. The reason why the WNBA, you know, has a hard time, why women's professional soccer folded, and even in the women's NCAA, you know, there's a women's tournament going on right now. Who knew, you know? Are men betting on that at the office? Probably not, you know?
Well, they should take Connecticut.
should.
It's easy money.
Now,
They
this
always
is where
win, yeah,
this is where, you know, it's yin and yang. So media will put on television what people want to see, and if people don't want to see women's sports, then it's not going to, you know, it's yin and yang. I think it is the bellwether for the ultimate problem of socialization of society toward women. I will note, however, small breakthrough, Natalie Randolph just became the women's football coach at Coolidge High in D.C. First woman ever to coach a football team at the high school or beyond level. So it's a small step. I call it the pigskin ceiling. She just dented.
How do we fix it? Certainly, I'm not a big sports person, but certainly there are some famous women athletes, the Williams sisters, women's soccer, Maria Hamm. How do we fix that? How do we figure out how to make the media as interested in other women's sports? By the way, a few years ago when the United States brought home its first, I believe its first gold medal in fencing was women's épée.
That's right.
Forget the woman's name. It was a great story, cute blonde. She came from behind. She didn't think she was going to win. I was sure I'd see her on a cereal box because of the coming from behind, being attractive, being our first Olympic woman. By the way, you know, the men's team didn't do that well that year, but you know what they did? They picked her up on her shoulders when she won, so we don't have to blame the male athletes. How do we get the media to be as invested?
You get a lot of beach volleyball on the tube.
You just nailed it. She was a cute blonde.
But she didn't get anywhere. She didn't get her
She didn't
Wheaties
get-
box.
yeah.
And swords are kind of innately interesting, don't you think?
Really.
Really, they are.
But, you
Well,
know,
you're back to Shakespeare. Well, frankly, it's the consumer. It's ratings, 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 and ratings, okay? Maybe one strategy might be to put some of those sports online and viral the heck out of them and create a viral number that causes them to then, because the trick is the mainstream media follows viral and viral follows the mainstream media. It is it's a dialogue, if you will. And you can drive both, you have to drive both ends. But if you're not breaking through in the mainstream, you can break through on the viral and send clips of whatever around through YouTube, et cetera, through Facebook, through Twitter, et cetera, and create the sense of ratings, if you will, that will then be picked up by the mainstream media. One of the interesting trends that's happened is that there was as an example of the squeaky wheel does matter, there was a big backlash, you may recall, against the only little girls who were, the only little girls abducted who were being talked about on television news were cute little white girls. And there was a huge backlash against that. And ever since then, for a while, there has been coverage of little black people being abducted, boys and girls. And I have seen a noticeable, perceptible difference in that. So it does matter.
well, you know, as the father of a young daughter, one of the things that is a real pet peeve of mine, you know, thinking of the media, are the focus on perceived attractiveness and one's worth. And you can think of reality show after reality show where women parade themselves in skimpy attire for the amusement and delight of men, or a single man in the case of The Bachelor. And as much as that bothers me and makes me sad for the males whose gender I share, I also realize that there are a great many women who are participating not only on these programs, but as viewers of these programs. And I'm just curious as to how you think we get at that.
Well, that whole issue of women's image, women's body type, and all of that, it's one of the things in women's institutions we talk about, we try to help women with. I was thinking during the Olympics, Lindsey Vonn, great skier, but man, the swimsuit issue of SI was sort of like right there with her. And I'm thinking, why did she have to do that? Why couldn't she just be a great skier? Well, that was her gig, I think we need to be very careful with young girls growing up. You want them to be healthy. You want them to do all the right things, be absolutely active. So I hope she's playing a sport if she likes a sport. But not caving into that peer pressure about how you look, how thin can you be, and are you stereotypically like every other girl? Sometimes I'll pass groups of girls in high school and I'll look around and I'm like, my God, they all look like clones, because the peer pressure is enormous there. And I think it starts with parents. So it's your job, Dad, and educators can help, but I really think it starts at home.
Well, you got nothing to worry about with me. We're going to move to another question from our audience.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask.
Absolutely.
My name is Zarina, and I'm very impressed with this panel, but I'm not going to deny that I don't feel left out because there's not an African American or a woman of color on the panel. And I remember many years ago doing some publicity work for Susan Taylor, who was the editor of Essence magazine, speaking in San Francisco, and she said the 4 categories of the most difficult situation for a person would be being poor, old, black woman. And I said, oh my, and I think many of the women that were there were feeling like, oh my goodness, that's going to be very difficult. But when I think on the other side of 3 very dynamic black women that I can speak to, Michelle Obama, the president of Rensselaer, who is the highest paid president in all the colleges and universities, who's African American, and Oprah Winfrey, the only billionaire woman who's in entertainment. So I'd just like to ask, what did you think when you saw your panel?
That did cross my mind, by the way, and I produce panels. I always make sure that there's you're absolutely correct. It's a diversity of experience, and we need all the talent we can get, all the perspectives we can get.
Yeah, I had the same reaction. Yeah. I didn't say it, so thank you for raising it.
But you all have spoken.
Don't you think? There's not any really young women here. There's not any women over 60 here. I think we're all within about a decade of each other. We look kind of alike in that way.
But you all have spoken, in large measure, and thank you for that question to the particular differences, in talking about women's issues. It's not just enough to say women. There's a particular issue with low-income women, with women of color, women of a certain age, whatever slice. Some of the other stereotypes and issues of discrimination that we have in society don't exclude women.
Well, but the other thing I want to say is it's not just about color and gender. There's a diversity of experience. Each of us has a completely different life story, a completely different trajectory. And that brings its own new perspectives. If we were behind something and you didn't know what our color was, you would still feel there was a huge diversity of opinions here and of perspectives here. So it's about a diversity of experience and how you and worldview, if you will, not just your color. But it is noticeable. There's no Hispanics on the table either.
Indeed. We're going to take one last question from the audience.
I guess I'm also piggybacking on the comment about women of color, because you had mentioned before that poor women seem to be the ones in the service industry, and my question is more to piggyback on yours. how do these women who don't have a voice, in quotes, get their voices heard? What is there for these women to do? Because all of you seem to have, you know, excelled in your fields, and so you can be a spokesperson or, you know, the voice of people who are in similar spaces, you know, despite the diversity of your experiences. But for people who don't have these kinds of voices and don't have the access to make these decisions in media, is it really only education? Because a lot of the poor kids don't have the same.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. To be able to point out that women have come together in coalitions and groups, and there was a club movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where when the first clubs started coming in, General Federation of Women's Clubs and some of these. But that's how women work so well together, is to come together, to support each other, and then as they become stronger as a group, then their voice can be heard.
The other thing I was just going to say is, a lot of the women in those positions may have access to joining a union. And they can get it, sometimes that's, well, that you're just asking for options, okay? You may not like that as an option, but sometimes
for a lot of women, that's not really an option. You know?
In some of the industries you're speaking of, right? Okay.
Well, that may be the problem itself.
Well, that may be the problem, but I'm just saying that is one way that some women in service professions do get some of a voice, is, again, it's in numbers. I mean, what she's talking about is you join together and you create a voice. But I would also say that if they have access to a computer and they can now you can, you know, anybody can be a blogger, anybody can create a viral voice. Any of these women can go to a public library, use a computer for free. I'm not judging them, I'm giving them an idea. They can go to a public library, use a computer, go to blogspot.com or Google and set up their own blog in 2 seconds and do
we're running short on time, so we're going to go to
I would say
McGuire
don't discount
here and then
education. There are a ton of educational opportunities for women and men at all levels in this region. There are a lot of language issues, there's a lot of literacy issues. You know, in the District of Columbia, 35% of the adults are functionally illiterate, and we know this. But there also are a tremendous number of programs. Trinity started a program east of the river over in Anacostia. We're the only university offering a degree program over there, and we now have almost 100 students in this program earning associate degrees who may not ever have thought that they could have earned a college degree. We have to keep the hope alive, and everyone will tell you, whether it's the president of the largest corporation in the world or a policymaker, education is the means out of poverty. It is the solution to poverty, and we've got to spread the gospel of education.
And just
unfortunately, we're going to have to close on that because we have run short on time. This has been an incredible conversation. I, for one, have loved it. Just talking about these myriad issues, and we really didn't cover about a third of what I wanted to cover, but that's the nature of these big topics. I'd just like to thank Catherine Azelford from the Georgetown Theater Company, and be sure on March 27th to participate and support Women Artists Now, Swan Day.
You can look us up on the web if you want to know details, where and when.
Fabulous, fabulous. We also have had Joan Michelson, who has talked a lot about just citing so many stats and data that really bring this issue into great perspective. Joan Wages, good luck with the National Women's History Museum. I sure hope you get a site soon. And Pat McGuire, the president of Trinity University. University has been profiled a lot recently.
Right.
Congratulations on your recent success and your 20 years there.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us and watching Voice Box. Thanks to our studio audience. I'm Christian Dorsey. We have had a great night, and we'll see you next month.